On today's Newsmakers, Israel and the end times, and Noah's Ark controversy and the trans debate. That and more coming up. Welcome to Newsmakers, a show where we go behind the headlines each week to bring you interviews with pastors, entertainers, politicians, and other notable figures. On today's Newsmakers, we are starting with a very interesting conversation. Pastor Greg Laurie will be joining us. He is here to explore the eyebrow-raising events that we see happening right now in the Middle East. We'll also be talking with Greg about a new project he has and plenty more. Let's welcome Greg Laurie to Newsmakers. Greg Laurie, lots to talk about today, but I want to start at a place that some people might not realize. You are not only a pastor, an evangelist, you do a whole lot, but you're also an artist, which is a really intriguing piece of your past and your story. Talk a little bit about your art. How did you realize you first had an affinity for it?
Well, it goes back to my childhood. If you saw the Jesus Revolution film, you remember that young Greg was always drawing. And that's actually very true. When I'd be waiting for my mom in smoky bars, late hours into the night, I had to do something to amuse myself. iPads hadn't been invented yet. So I just always had a tablet, paper, and my pens. And I created my own alternate universe, our cartoon world that effectively I would retreat to. You know, I think that you will find sometimes when comedians are interviewed, it shouldn't surprise you to find out they came from troubled childhoods and developed humor as sort of a defense mechanism, a way to cope in life. Well, that was certainly true of me. I used humor as a way to deflect pain and just to live. And so I loved drawing, and I had great admiration for Charles M. Schulz, the creator of Peanuts, and Walt Disney, and I just loved cartoons. And so I continued to do artwork when I started to speak. And so that was sort of my way of sowing tents, if you will. Remember Paul the Apostle sowed tents. So that was kind of my way to supplement my income, which was non-existent as a preacher. And so, you know, that was a way to kind of get by. And then as time passed, I drew less and less, and I preached more and more. And so now fast forward to today, I mean, I still draw, and I've always drawn, and we have an art department. I get very involved in all of our design. I'm really opinionated about it. So love to play in that world. But the opportunity came for us to animate my characters, Ben Born Again in Yellow Dog, and I jumped at the idea. And so now we have our first one out. And the best way to watch it is go download our Harvest Plus app. Just go to the App Store on your phone or your device. It's there for iOS and Android, etc. But now we have this cartoon, and the title of the cartoon is The Bridge Is Out. It's 7 minutes long. We're getting great response. One lady just wrote me, and she said she has an autistic son, and it's very hard for her to communicate with him, but they watched this cartoon together, and they were able to have a wonderful conversation about the Lord that they'd never been able to have before. Wow. I've already heard stories of kids coming to the Lord watching this cartoon because it's entertaining, it's fun, and it's evangelistic. And I don't know that I've ever seen an evangelistic cartoon.
Yeah, and last question for you, because probably, gosh, nearing towards 10 years now, 8 years ago, you were a source in a book that I wrote called Armageddon Code. You gave great interviews talking about the end of days. And, you know, I look back then just 8 years ago or 7 years ago, and I look at where we are now. And a lot of people, obviously, they're wondering. And of course, we don't know the day or the hour. Where are we? But when you look out there and you see all these things happening, what goes through your mind in terms of maybe the proximity that we are towards the end of days?
Well, the Bible tells us in the end times that Israel would be isolated, and ultimately she would be attacked from her neighbor to her north, identified as Magog. Many scholars believe Magog is modern-day Russia. I would tend to agree with that. But regardless of if Russia is Magog or not, this large force will attack her, and God says he's going to intervene on her behalf. But I would say the rise of anti-Semitism is a real sign of the times. And I have to admit, Billy, even I have been shocked by the extreme anti-Semitism we've seen recently. Of course, when Israel was attacked on October 7th, that was shocking. But what has been as shocking, perhaps, is protests around the world, largely among young people, in favor of Hamas. Who would have ever thought in the modern day, in 2024, we would hear people chant phrases like, "Gas the Jews"? The Holocaust was not that long ago. There are still people alive today that remember the Holocaust. And to see this same kind of mentality, this hatred of Jewish people that really was happening before the Jewish people were sent off to those camps like Auschwitz and Ravensbrück and Treblinka and many others. And so the Christian needs to speak up for the Jewish people. And God has promised a blessing to those who would bless the Jews and a curse for those who would curse the Jews. God says to Abraham and his descendants, "I'll bless those that bless you and curse those that curse you." So I appeal to all my Christian friends. I appeal specifically to pastors out there to speak on this topic. Talk to your people about it. And it's important that we love the Jewish people and that we support the nation Israel. But coming back to your original question, well, obviously, we've never been closer than we are right now to the Lord's return. And in my view, the next event on the prophetic calendar is the rapture of the church, which could happen at any moment.
At any moment. And you have wonderful sermons on this. You've done series on this, and people can check that out. And also, obviously, we were here today to talk about the adventures of Ben Born Again and Yellow Dog, and people can head over to the Harvest Plus app, download it, and watch the show. Greg, as always, it was wonderful chatting with you today.
Thanks, Billy.
Be sure to follow Greg Laurie on social media at Greg Laurie for more of his takes on faith and current events. Up next, a theologian recently ignited all sorts of controversy over Noah's Ark. We're going to hear what he has to say about it. This is Newsmakers on the CBN News Channel. Welcome back to Newsmakers on the CBN News Channel. Our next guest is Gavin Ortlund. He's the president of Truth Unites, and he recently made a social media splash after explaining his belief that the Genesis flood, Noah's Ark, that narrative was potentially a regional and not a global event. Let's welcome him to break it all down here on Newsmakers. So you recently found yourself at the center of some discussion and debate over Noah and the Ark. Let's start with the beginning of that. How did that discussion and debate begin?
Yeah, I put out a video arguing that the flood of Noah in Genesis 6-8 can be interpreted as talking about a regional event that was in a huge area of the earth, but not all over the globe. And I did that just because I know this is a topic that causes some people, especially Christians who are more scientifically minded, but also some of those looking into the Christian faith. This is a real issue for a lot of people. And I just wanted to help people understand some of the arguments for that view, help people understand that there actually are differences within Orthodox Christianity historically. A lot of people are not aware of that. And in my own journey on these things, and then in the kind of ministry I desire to have, I've just become convinced that we have to talk about these things, and we have to kind of try to help people understand what are the arguments on each side for and against.
Sure. Yeah. And then you have salvation issues, and you have things that are not salvation issues. I think Noah's Ark is one of those things, because a lot of people see the argument as one being a literalist argument and one being non. And so even this idea of a local flood, as you were saying, a lot of people maybe haven't heard about this. So what is your personal take now on this? Do you believe personally it's local? Do you believe it was worldwide? Where do you sort of stand on that?
I incline toward thinking it was local or regional. Sometimes I use the word local and people think really small. So I'm trying to use the word regional more.
Sure.
I'm not 100% sure about that. I really agree with what you just said, that this is not a salvation issue. Now, if we were to talk about the truth of Scripture about this, that would be more important. But here we're talking about how to interpret these 3 chapters in Genesis. And there really is a good case, actually, that in its original meaning, the author and the original hearers wouldn't be thinking of planet Earth, all of the globe of planet Earth. So this is just a matter of interpreting scripture. But yeah, I incline toward thinking it probably was a local or regional event. And, there's lots of arguments for that. We have to remember that humanity at this point appears to also have just been regional. This is before the dispersion of human beings that happens after the Tower of Babel in Genesis 10 and 11. So all of human beings are in this one portion of the earth at this point before they had dispersed throughout the world. So that's one of the considerations that's really important here.
Obviously, when you put this video out, and you're no stranger to putting out videos that might get reaction, obviously, on some difficult topics like this one, what happened? What were people saying? What were the responses like?
Yeah, it was interesting. The YouTube comments were pretty much what I expected. Some disagreeing, some appreciative, kind of a mix. But on Twitter, or X, as I guess we now call it, there was also a mix, but there was a lot more negative responses. And I don't know how social media always works, where something can sometimes get in the algorithms in a certain way, and certain people tend to run with it, and it becomes more visible in certain circles. But for whatever reason, yeah, I got a lot of reactions, and I wasn't actually that shocked by that. And nor did it faze me too much. As you say, I mean, this is part of the world we live in right now. But I would just say my heart burns with a passion to try to help people experience assurance in the gospel. And this is an issue that causes people deep anxiety. And I think a lot of the reason for that is just because people have never learned about the history of the, and I put out a follow-up video just walking through the history of how many godly Orthodox Christians have held to this view. So I think a lot of that reaction, if I don't want to be rude to anyone, but I do think it may have been coming from a place of maybe a more immediate response, not necessarily a very studied response. And so that's part of why I'm glad this is going on, hoping that this will at least cause people to think more deeply about this, and maybe give some listening and consideration to why a lot of Orthodox and evangelical Christians have seen it in this more regional way.
As you sort of reflect on this and look at the reaction, and again, you're not new to this, but yeah, there's a lot of intense response when these sorts of things happen in general. What's some advice you have to people on both sides of this issue, on both sides of really any issue, people in the church, when it comes to maybe how we should discuss and debate these issues while using grace along the way?
I'm really glad you're asking about that. And this is something that's probably on my heart on this topic even more than the actual issue at hand, because I'm interested in this primarily to try to remove it from being a stumbling block for people receiving the gospel. My ministry and what I want to give my life to is helping people find Christ, and this can be a challenge for people. But I think the way we talk about something like this, the way we work it through in our disagreements, is just as important as the issue itself sometimes, and in certain ways can even be more important sometimes. If we do not speak to each other with love in our hearts, and I'm saying this to my own heart as well right now, but all across the board, then those non-Christians looking on observe that. It's been interesting to me to watch my non-Christian atheist friends watch this discussion play out. All of us need to remember that the way we conduct our theological disagreements is a reflection of the gospel to those around us. And if we disagree, but we do so with love and with humility and with real sincere in our hearts listening, that will be noticed by those around us. And that's one of the great things we should do right now, to try to make the gospel clear to those onlooking, because our world is so hurting right now and desperate to see that. When they see real kindness, not compromise, but real kindness, I think that stands out right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as Christians, we have to say to ourselves, we talk a lot about culture and lament culture, rightfully so. Are we allowing the negative of social media and culture to come into the church and impact how we are responding to one another? Because that is actually something I think we probably don't think about as much as we need to when we see these sorts of debates unfold. I saw your debate unfolding. I reached out to you and I thought this would be an interesting conversation, and it truly has been, and would love to have you back again. I'm sure there'll be plenty of other issues to talk about. Appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much, Billy. Great to talk with you.
This, of course, is not a new debate, as he said. For more information on the other side of those who say, hey, this is a global event, you can read what Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis have to say on the matter. We'll be right back on the other side of the break with a look inside the transgender debate. This is Newsmakers on the CBN News Channel. Welcome back to Newsmakers on the CBN News Channel. For our final segment, we are sitting down with Christian Post reporter Brandon Showalter. He is going to join us to speak about his work to expose how the transgender movement is impacting children and adults alike. Let's welcome Brandon to Newsmakers. Brandon Showalter, so appreciate you coming on today. We have a lot to talk about. You have a new season of your podcast, Generation Indoctrination, and we will get into that. But I want to start with this issue of gender and what is happening in culture right now. So many issues the public have moved more into a secular arena on, and yet on gender, it's really a situation where the public, when you look at the polls, they're not supportive of transitioning children. The public does not want to see a lot of these things being taught in schools. Why do you think this one issue is so unique in that the public is not really moving alongside with the more progressive side of things?
What I believe, Billy, is that I think that this issue does tap into something very primal. And I would just say that the other aspect of that is that when you see children being hurt, that really gets people's attention. And we live in an age when doctors will go to work tomorrow and cut the breasts off of 13-year-old girls. I'm not making that up. We're watching children become sterilized. And when you're not able to procreate and have a family, that's a very primal and human thing. And so I think even people who are very secular, they're not religious people, it taps into something deeply human. And when people realize what's at stake, that children are being harmed in this way and that they are having their options, foreclosed because of an experimental medical treatment protocol that has no basis in science, and there's no long-term studies to confirm that gender confusion in children should be treated with, blockers, hormones, and surgery. I think just the extreme nature of it and the fact that it erases people's options, it taps into something primal and very human. And even secular people don't want to see that happen. Possibly another option, another dimension rather, to this is that even in this country where we do have, Judeo-Christian norms and ethics, that has shaped the public mind in a way where even if people don't personally believe in God, that still does affect their thinking. And so perhaps some of the residual effects of that are still causing people to think that this gender transitioning, I don't even like that phrase, but that this is just a bridge too far. And I think that's a moment of grace.
What has affected you most, especially in this season of the podcast, you also, in addition to hearing from families, you heard from, detransitioners. There's one story in particular that's very heartbreaking. What is it like for you as a trained journalist to go through listening to these stories that are incredibly, incredibly difficult to listen to?
I think what is the most difficult thing to realize is that you realize that, for me, it's just, I've had such a hard time coming to grips with the fact that this is actually real. And I'm not sure that I would even believe these stories unless I was the one actually hearing them on the front lines. And I cannot believe some of what I'm hearing, but I'm seeing original documents. I have source material. I've seen photos that I've had to get counseling for of these medical atrocities, these brutalized bodies. And it's hard not to just want to scream sometimes because what you're seeing is so unbelievably horrible. And you don't think that in a country like the United States that something like this could happen, but it's happening. I mean, I said earlier, it is not an exaggeration to say that 13-year-old girls have had their breasts cut off. Healthy breasts, the healthy tissue has been amputated. I've seen medical journals where 15 and 16-year-old boys have had their genitals amputated, and they're using stomach lining or intestinal tissue to make a fake vagina out of it. This is an absolute nightmarish monstrosity. And when you're on the front lines of seeing that and having the responsibility to document that, both in print and on our podcast, it's just a harrowing thing, and there's no easy way to express it. I tell the story often where I've had the frustration of going home to the countryside of Virginia where I'm from, and I start to talk about some of what I'm reporting on, and they look at me as though I have 5 or 6 heads. That was years ago. Now they realize that I'm actually telling the truth, and that these horrors, these atrocities are really, really real. And it's as though they can't believe it because it's so grisly and unpleasant to hear and deal with. But the hard thing is the hardest thing is by far hearing about the children and the young people being hurt. And perhaps even more than that, hearing the palpable, excruciating anguish of the parents and the families who feel as though their lives have been destroyed and shattered. And that's not, and again, I'm not being hyperbolic here. This has ruined everything that it touches. It's one of the worst medical scandals in human history. I think especially, and it's especially bad because this has been marketed to our youth in terms of identity. I don't think we've ever seen a scourge like this be presented to young people as though their identity hangs upon undergoing experimental drugs and having their healthy body parts cut off. They actually believe, they've been ideologically indoctrinated to believe that unless they undergo these brutal medical practices, that they're somehow not living their truest, most authentic selves. I mean, the ideological brainwashing that has happened concurrently with these brutalities is just astonishing in its degree and scope. And that's just a hard thing to have to be sober-minded and document journalistically. But we have to.
Well, Brandon Showalter, I appreciate you taking us through all of it. The show is Generation Indoctrination. You can listen to it right now over at the Christian Post. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Billy.
You can listen to Brandon's podcast, Generation Indoctrination, on your favorite podcast platforms, wherever that may be. And we are going to be right back in just a moment with more Newsmakers here on the CBN News Channel. That's all for Newsmakers. Thank you for watching, and be sure to head over to the CBN News YouTube channel. That's where you will find the full interviews that you saw on today's episode. Plus, you can check out our new daily Newsmakers podcast. We feature one full interview every single day. You can subscribe to that show. Again, it's also called Newsmakers on your favorite podcast platform. Until then, we'll see you next week.